The mother sat on the thin mattress on the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall of the small apartment. The sound of a dripping faucet echoed through the room, a slow, rhythmic reminder of everything she had tried and failed to fix. Her son sat cross-legged nearby, his small fingers gripping a broken pencil, scratching lines across a wrinkled piece of paper that had already been drawn on countless times. She watched him with a hollow ache in her chest, a mixture of love, so fierce it burned, and a guilt so heavy it bent her shoulders forward. Her stomach growled, a sharp twist of emptiness she had learned to ignore. It had been 2 days since she had eaten a proper meal, every crumb and scrap saved for him. The cupboards were bare except for a half-empty bag of rice, and even that felt like a cruel countdown. Rent was 2 months overdue. The landlord had already stopped knocking, switching instead to sliding threatening notes under the door. The electricity flickered on and off, the heat barely warm enough to hold back, the creeping cold that seeped through the thin walls. She had already pawned everything of value, the television, the microwave, even the necklace her mother had left her. All that remained were the bare essentials, and those too were slipping away. She had spent the morning walking to the nearest charity office, waiting in line with her child clinging to her coat, only to be told there were no more funds, no more vouchers, no more help. The words were spoken gently, but they landed like a slap. She had smiled politely, thanked them, and walked away with her head high, only to collapse in a side street where no one could see the tears she had been holding back. By late afternoon, the sun had already begun to dip behind the apartment blocks, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. She sat at the small table by the window, the light dim and gray, staring at an old library card she had found wedged between unpaid bills. It had been months since she last stepped into the public library, a place that once offered warmth and escape when her son was younger. Now it felt like another world. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a scrap of paper, the back of an old receipt, and a pen that barely worked. She hesitated, pressing the tip to the paper, the weight of the moment stealing her breath. Then, slowly she began to write. "Please, if you find this, I need help. I have a child. No food, no money, no family. We are cold, we are hungry. Please, anything you can do." She stared at the words, her vision blurred by the sting of tears. It felt ridiculous, humiliating even, to believe that a stranger would stumble upon this note and care. But she had exhausted every other option. She folded the paper carefully, smoothing it between her palms as if trying to press her desperation into its creases. She tucked it into her coat pocket and gathered her son, wrapping him in layers too thin for the cold. Together they walked in silence to the library, the streets growing darker, the city bustling around them, without noticing the small figure moving against the tide. Inside, the library was warm, filled with the soft rustle of pages turning and the quiet tap of fingers on keyboards. She felt almost ashamed to step inside, her worn shoes damp from the street, her son's cheeks flushed red with cold. They wandered through the aisles, pretending to browse, her eyes scanning the shelves for a place to leave the note. Her son clutched a worn picture book, his eyes lighting up for the first time that day. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to believe that maybe this small act of hope mattered. She slipped the folded paper between the pages of a thick hardcover, chosen at random, and gently pushed it back onto the shelf. Her hands lingered there for a moment, as if unwilling to let go, before she turned away. As they left, the mother looked back over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a foolish plan, she told herself, a whisper into the void. But it was all she had left. Outside, the night had settled in fully, the cold cutting through her coat, the city, lights harsh and uncaring. She pulled her son close, kissing the top of his head, and walked home, with her arms wrapped around him, praying to no one in particular that someone, anyone, would find that note and care enough to reach back. The next morning came without mercy. a pale winter light filtering through the thin curtains as the mother opened her eyes to the sound of her son coughing softly beside her. She lay still for a moment, listening to his shallow breaths, feeling the weight of another day pressing down before her feet even touched the floor. She reached out and touched his forehead gently, relieved to find it cool, though his thin body trembled under the blankets. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and moved through the apartment with practiced stillness. The kitchen was empty except for the half cup of rice she had saved from the night before, and as she boiled water over the weak burner, she stared at the window, watching the people outside hurrying past with their heads down, wrapped in scarves and thick coats, faces she no longer recognized, a world that no longer saw her. After feeding her son, stretching the meager portion as far as she could, the mother bundled him in his coat and scarf and set out once again, determined to face whatever waited on the other side of the door. She had a list of places to visit, scraps of information gathered from overheard conversations and faded flyers tacked to telephone poles. There was the church 2 blocks away, rumored to have a food pantry, though the last time she visited, they had turned her away with a strained apology and empty hands. There was the community center at the edge of town, though it often had a line that wrapped around the building by sunrise. She clutched her son's small hand tightly in hers as they made their way through the bitter wind, her feet aching inside shoes that had long lost their shape, her breath visible in sharp white puffs. The church doors were locked when she arrived. A small handwritten sign taped to the entrance, closed until further notice. She stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She turned away, pulling her son close as they walked to the next stop, her legs heavy, her heart heavier. At the community center, the line stretched down the block, families bundled together for warmth, eyes lowered in quiet defeat. She stood at the end of the line for a time, watching as volunteers moved back and forth, handing out small bags of groceries, until a soft voice reached her ears. A woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile approached, apologizing in hushed tones. "We're out of food. I'm so sorry. Maybe try back next week." The mother nodded, swallowing her shame, thanking the woman as if gratitude could disguise the hollow in her chest. She walked away slowly, her son's small legs struggling to keep up, his face buried in her coat. The rest of the day passed in much the same way, each place they visited offering the same kind of emptiness she had come to expect. Phone calls went unanswered, messages left without reply. She knocked on the doors of people she had once called friends, only to find windows dark, voices hushed on the other side, the sound of locks turning in place. By nightfall, her body ached with exhaustion, her mind blurred with despair. When they returned home, the apartment felt colder than before, the walls pressing in, the silence deepening. She sat at the table, her head in her hands, her son curled up on the mattress nearby, clutching the picture book they had borrowed from the library, its pages soft and worn. She watched him from across the room, his eyes heavy with sleep, and wondered if he remembered the world before it became so hard, if he still dreamed of things beyond this small, crumbling space. The note she had left at the library flickered through her thoughts, a distant memory, a foolish hope she could barely bring herself to believe in anymore. She closed her eyes and breathed in the dark, the sound of the faucet dripping, the whisper of wind against the window, the quiet surrender of a woman who had run out of places to turn. Morning came again, not as a fresh start, but as a continuation of the quiet struggle that had no clear end. The mother rose before the sun, slipping from beneath the thin blanket without waking her son, her body sore from night spent, curled on the hard floor. She moved through the apartment on bare feet, the cold linoleum biting at her skin, and paused at the window to watch the sky shift from black to pale gray. Outside, the world stirred to life, but inside, time had settled into a kind of stillness, a waiting that stretched from hour to hour with no promise of change. She made tea from boiled water and a single withered tea bag, turning it into a kind of ritual that masked the absence of breakfast. She ran her fingers through her son's hair as he stirred awake, smoothing the tangles as he blinked up at her, his eyes still wide with the softness of childhood. She helped him dress, layering his small body in clothes too thin for the weather, and kissed the top of his head as he tucked the picture book under his arm. He asked if they could go back to the library later, and she smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead, her heart aching at the simplicity of his wish. The streets were busy, people moving past them with the urgency of those who had somewhere to be, coats buttoned tight, hats pulled low. She moved among them, invisible, her son's hand in hers, her mind a blur of calculations and silent pleas. She stopped at the pharmacy, asking about a cheaper brand of cough medicine, only to be met with a polite shake of the head. She checked the public notice board, hoping for new flyers about odd jobs or community aid, but found only old postings curled at the edges, the ink faded and unreadable. She walked the length of the market street, watching as vendors set up, their stalls, the scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh bread drifting on the wind, a cruel reminder of what they could not afford. As the day wore on, the cold seeped deeper into her bones. She counted coins in her pocket, fingers stiff with the chill, and bought a small bread roll to split between them. They sat on a bench near the library, her son nibbling at his half, swinging his legs as if the world were still full of possibility. She rested a hand on his back, feeling the sharp curve of his spine beneath the layers, and wondered how much longer she could keep holding everything together. She thought about the note she had hidden, the fragile hope folded into its paper, and felt a flicker of shame at her own desperation. She told herself not to think about it, not to count on something so uncertain, but the thought clung to her, stubborn and persistent, like a whisper at the back of her mind. That evening, they returned home as the sky darkened the apartment, cold and dim. She lit a candle to save on electricity and boiled the last of the rice, stirring it slowly as the sound of her son's soft coughing filled the room. She sat with him as he read from his borrowed book, his voice stumbling over the words, his small fingers tracing the pictures. She smiled and nodded, her throat tight with the effort of holding herself steady, of pretending that everything was fine. When he fell asleep, she stayed by his side, listening to the sound of his breathing, watching the shadows flicker on the walls. She wondered if anyone had found the note, if it had been tossed aside or slipped between careless hands, unread and forgotten. In the silence of the night, with the weight of the world pressing into her chest, she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her. The apartment was cold, the cupboards were empty, the future uncertain, but for now, she had made it through another day, and in the dark, beneath the doubt and fear, a small thread of hope still stirred, fragile and frayed, but unbroken. The cold had deepened overnight, and when morning came, it slipped into the apartment through every crack and seam, wrapping itself around the mother's thin frame as she stirred awake. She felt it in her fingers as she reached for her son, in her toes as they touched the floor, in her breath as it came out in pale clouds against the air. She pulled her son's blanket tighter around him and sat at the table with her head in, her hands trying to will herself into motion. Outside, the city moved on, uncaring, and inside, she sat with the gnawing awareness that she had run out of things to give. She dressed slowly, mechanically, bundling herself in her coat, slipping shoes onto her son's feet, pressing a kiss to his forehead without words. They set out again into the wind, the streets familiar now in their indifference. She had no clear destination, only a restless need to keep moving, as if walking might delay the collapse she could feel building inside. She stopped at a shelter on the far side of town, a place someone had mentioned in passing, and stood in the doorway while a man in a worn uniform shook his head and told her they were at capacity. She smiled faintly, thanked him, and turned away, her heart sinking a little further. By midday, she found herself sitting on the steps of a closed storefront, her son curled against her side, his head on her shoulder, his body limp with exhaustion. She stared down at her hands, at the dry cracks on her knuckles, at the pale skin stretched too thin. She felt the dizzying pull of hunger, of weariness, of weeks spent pushing past her own limits. Her son stirred beside her, murmuring softly, and she smoothed his hair with a tenderness that belied the ache in her chest. She rose slowly, lifting him into her arms, his weight a comfort and a burden both, and began the long walk home. They passed the library on their way, its windows warm with light, its shelves lined with the quiet promise of another world. She hesitated at the door, one hand resting on the cold metal, her breath fogging the glass. For a moment she considered going inside, checking the shelf, searching for some sign that her note had been found, that someone had seen her plea. But the thought of hoping, of opening herself to that kind of vulnerability, was too much to bear. She turned away, pressing her face into her son's hair, and kept walking. It was in the middle of the street, not far from home, that her body finally gave out. Her knees buckled without warning, her vision narrowed, the ground rushing up to meet her. She felt her son's small hands on her face, his voice rising in panic, calling to her, shaking her with the fierce urgency of a child who did not yet understand the cruelty of the world. Around them, people passed without stopping, glancing and looking away, the hurried footsteps of strangers who wanted no part in another person's sorrow. She lay there for a long moment, the cold seeping into her bones, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar in her ears. She wondered if this was it, if this was how quiet endings came, not with drama or noise, but with stillness and indifference. Somehow she pushed herself up, her arms trembling, her legs unsteady beneath her. She gathered her son into her arms, murmuring reassurances she barely believed, and stumbled the rest of the way home. Inside the apartment, the darkness was waiting, and she sank to the floor, cradling her son, her body shaking with exhaustion, her mind numb with the weight of failure. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence, to the drip of the faucet, to the sound of her son's breathing, and let herself slip into the emptiness she had been holding at bay for so long. She thought of the note she had left behind, of the words she had written in trembling script, of the fragile hope she had folded into the pages of a book, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it had been foolish to believe that anyone would answer. She didn't know how long she sat there on the cold floor, her back against the wall, her son curled up against her chest, his small body warming the hollow of her arms. Time had loosened its grip on her, minutes bleeding into hours, the light outside shifting from gray to black without her noticing. The apartment had become a kind of cocoon, thin walls, thin blankets, thin hopes, but within its narrow confines, the mother had folded herself around her son like a shield against a world that had turned its face away. She barely registered the sounds outside, the hum of cars, the muffled voices in the hallway, the occasional knock on a neighbor's door that was never for her. Her mind drifted through the days behind her, the ones that had brought her here, and the ones she feared were still to come, stretching out before her in an endless procession of closed doors. It was nearly night when the knock came, soft at first, barely audible over the whisper of the wind against the window pane. She thought at first she had imagined it, the sound of her own desperation shaping itself into phantom noises. But then it came again, firmer this time, pulling her out of the haze that had settled over her. She forced herself to her feet, legs stiff and trembling, her body aching from the fall, the hunger, the relentless march of days without rest. She crossed the room, her heart thudding in her chest, and pressed one hand against the door as if to steady herself. For a moment she simply stood there, her breath caught in her throat, unsure whether to open or to stay in the safety of her small world. When she finally turned the handle, The cold rushed in first, followed by the sight of a woman standing in the dim light of the hallway, a paper bag clutched in her arms and a folded slip of paper in her hand. The mother's eyes dropped instantly to the paper, her breath catching as she recognized the edges, the handwriting, the note she had written in a moment of quiet despair. The woman offered a small, hesitant smile, the kind that carries both apology and urgency. She spoke softly, explaining that she had found the note tucked inside a children's book at the library, that she had read the trembling lines once, twice, unable to set them aside, unable to shake the feeling of a voice, calling out through the silence. The mother could not find her voice. She stood there, one hand still on the doorframe, the other pressed unconsciously to her chest, as if to steady the storm inside. She watched as the woman gently set the paper bag down just inside the door. The faint scent of bread and soup, drifting up, the weight of it heavier with meaning than with substance. The woman spoke again, offering a phone number scribbled on a scrap of paper, a contact at a local shelter, someone who could help, someone who was waiting to help. She said she would come back tomorrow, that she would not leave them alone in this. And then, with one last glance, she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps soft and measured, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty. The mother closed the door slowly, her hands trembling, her breath uneven as she leaned back against the wood. She slid down to the floor, the paper bag beside her, the slip of paper clutched in her fingers, the shape of a stranger's kindness pressed into her palm. Her son stirred on the mattress, his voice small and sleepy as he called to her, and she moved to his side, wrapping him in her arms, pressing her face into his hair as the tears came. Not the tears of defeat or hopelessness, but the quieter, more dangerous tears of someone who has carried too much for too long and has just been offered a hand to help lift the weight. For the first time in a long time, the apartment no longer felt like a cage. The walls were still thin, the cupboard still bare, but the air was different now, charged with the faintest spark of something she had almost forgotten, the possibility that tomorrow might not be the same as today. She stayed there on the floor beside her son, the note that had traveled from her trembling hands to a stranger's heart, resting between them. And she let herself believe, just for that moment, that even in the coldest, loneliest corners of the world, someone might still be listening,